Hey guys, I'm Alex Pierce. Today we're going to be talking about Octane for Blender, cycles, and e-cycles. Which one is the best one for you? What are some of the pros and cons of each one? And even if it's not going to help you decide which one to use, at least it'll hopefully show you some of the differences between them. This isn't really a hands-on tutorial. Most of my tutorials are very hands-on, how to do this. This is not one of those tutorials. If you want to know more about Octane for Blender or e-cycles, how to get it set up, how to start working in it, I have a lot of videos coming that will go over step-by-step how to do a lot of these things. So if you're interested in those, make sure to subscribe and also push that whatever that notification bell is, so you'll be notified when those videos come out. This is also not a side-by-side video. I'm not going to be saying this one is faster because of this, and I'm going to show you this and this and this. Not really going to get into all that. This is really more my opinions over using e-cycles and cycles and Octane for Blender. I've been using Octane for Blender for a few months now, e-cycles for maybe 8 months, and Blender cycles for a few years. And I do this full time for work for clients. We do enterprise VR, enterprise training, 3D for web, all sorts of stuff. But I use Blender probably 6 days a week. so yeah, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the pros and cons of all these. Like any software, to find out which one is best for you, there's so many variables. It really depends on how you're using it. If you're doing texture baking, if you're doing rendering, if you're doing animation, if you're doing high poly, low poly, all those things have to be taken into account. So there's no silver bullet. This is better than that. Anyone who claims there is probably is thinking of it from one perspective. For me, I have a hybrid approach where I basically use all three for different reasons. I'll use e-cycles, I'll use cycles, and I'll use Octane. By far, I use e-cycles the most. I would say probably 60% of the time I'm using e-cycles. But there are a lot of things that Octane does that's just amazing and does way better than cycles or e-cycles does. So we'll get in a little bit into that here in a little bit. So, okay, we're going to start with e-cycles because I think it's going to be the easiest to talk about. It'll definitely be the shortest to talk about because I think there's a very big reason to use it and only one real reason to not use it. So the best reason to use e-cycles, in my opinion, is it's the best balance of speed and ease of use. And that'll make a lot more sense when you get to the end of the video. But e-cycles is very easy to use. It's easier than cycles to use. And it's also as fast as Octane in my test. So using an RTX card, a single RTX 2080, I've been able to get basically the same response, the same speed out of Octane for Blender and e-cycles, and using the denoise settings correctly and all that. Again, I'm not trying to make a claim that one is faster than the other. I'm just saying in my tests it's about the same, Octane and e-cycles. So e-cycles is very fast, it's very flexible, and it's very easy to use. And if you're familiar with cycles, it's basically the same thing with a few extra buttons and a lot underneath the hood. So the biggest reason to not use e-cycles, you can probably already tell, is the cost. That's the only reason I can really think why someone would not want to use e-cycles. So you can get it here at blendermarket.com. I'll leave a link in the description. But yeah, you can see here if you have an RTX card, it costs $300. And I believe it's basically per year. So when they start releasing new Blender versions 2021, I think I'm going to have to buy this again. For me, that's fine. Like I said, we use Blender every single day, and I think the speed and the workflow makes it totally worth it. And we can build that to our clients, and we can make up the money, no problem. However, $300 is still $300, and especially if you're a freelancer or if you're just getting into this, or you don't really need the speed, that could be the only reason that I would say, okay, maybe you don't need it. If you don't have an RTX card, you could argue that, well, you're not going to get as much speed updates as this version, so do you really need this? And I would say that in some ways you might need this version even more, because if you don't have an RTX card, then your render times are already very slow. So I'm not going to go through all of these cycles. I have other videos. If you want to see, I'll put a link in the description. You can see my initial reactions to e-cycles. I'm obviously a huge fanboy. And if you look on their site here, you can see these tests here, and these are all real tests. These are not inflated by any means. And e-cycles just blows Blender out of the water, or cycles out of the water, I should say. And I'll just show you real quick. Again, this isn't really a hands-on tutorial, but but I'll show you a little bit of E-Cycles just so you're familiar. So E-Cycles, here it is. It looks just like Blender. The only real difference you tell from the beginning is the icons are different here. It has the E-Cycles icon. And the biggest difference is in the render tab. So if you go to the render tab, you have these quick settings here. Actually, these first 3 tabs here, these are really the meat of the new settings that are in E-Cycles that Cycles doesn't have. So quick settings is great. You can change, okay, I want to have a fast render time, or I want to have a physically correct one. And you can even do this clay, which is pretty cool for certain things. And then you can change your sample count very quickly. You can change your bounces, strength, all that stuff. All this stuff is great because it's all right here. And you don't have to worry about digging through the render tab and, oh, wait, what tab is this in? What tab is that in? Rendering in the background also speeds up the render a little bit. And again, I'm not going to get too much into this, but I love being able to change the resolution right here in the render tab. The other huge deal is this denoise. So normally, if I go into the compositing tab, right, you might need to set up a denoise pass. But in E-Cycles, they have their own AI denoise, and I've found that it works better than Blender's. And to set it up, it's very easy. All you have to do is go to the render tab, and then here just push create, and then it automatically creates this this denoise tree for you. And the other thing that's great is it has this denoise strength. I pretty much never want to denoise at 1, which is 100%. At least, or at most, I'm going to say 0.9, because if it's too smooth, it doesn't look real. So I love that they've already put in a mix node, and you can change it all right from the render tab. So yeah, E-Cycles is great. I love it. Go get it if you have the money. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Cycles now. You're probably already familiar with Cycles. If you've downloaded Blender, you've probably used Cycles. And so I don't need to I can already assume that you know some of the things about Cycles that we don't need to get into detail with. But the main reason to use Cycles is it's free and it's easy to set up and easy to use. So when we get to Octane, we'll talk a little bit about how you have to set it up. But if you've installed Blender, you've installed Cycles. You have a new version of Blender, you just install Blender and you have Cycles. You don't have to reinstall anything or anything like that. With Octane, it's sort of a process. You have to go to Octane's website, you have to sign up for an account in the forum, you have to download it, you have to download an enterprise server, or not an enterprise server, but a license server. You have to run the license. There's a bunch to it. And then when you need to update, you have to kind of do it again. So the setup is what it is. You also, if you need the latest version of Blender, that's another reason why you probably want to just stick with Cycles, because Octane for Blender is always going to be a little bit behind. Right now, I think they're on 2.83.6. And if you need 2.91 alpha for some specific feature, then you're going to have to wait a while. So that's another quick reason. The other thing is, if you don't have an Nvidia GPU or you have an old Nvidia GPU, Octane or regular Cycles will probably be better than Octane. Octane really wants an Nvidia GPU. I mean, I think a lot of rendering engines do, but I think Octane really, really needs it. That's not scientific. That's just my opinion. So take it for what it is. If I'm wrong, let me know. The other thing is, if render speeds don't really matter to you, if you're not rendering at all, if you don't need to actually render, if you're using it to export to game engine or whatever, you don't really care about render speeds, then the main benefits of Octane probably don't outweigh the cons of Octane. Just stick with Cycles, because there's a lot of things that are more complicated once you get into Octane. And same with animation. If you're rendering an animation, then you really have to have, in my opinion, you really need to be using Octane or E-Cycles, if for no other reason than persistent data. So persistent data means that when you render an animation, say you have 1,000 frames. In regular Cycles right now, there's no persistent data, which means on the first frame, it's going to take like 30 seconds, depending on your scene, take like 30 seconds for it to load all the shaders and all this different stuff. Sometimes it could take minutes, right, to load all that before it even starts rendering. Gets to frame 2, and it starts that process over again. It takes another 30 seconds to load the data before it starts rendering. In Octane and in E-Cycles, it has persistent data. So it's the first frame takes 30 seconds for it to load. The second frame, it doesn't have to do that again, ever, for the rest of the animation. So you have 1,000 frames, you can quickly save a lot of time, sometimes hours and hours, just from having persistent data. And there's also a lot of other little tweaks you can do in Octane that you can't really do in Cycles, because it is a more mature render engine than Cycles. It's a lot more robust. There's a lot more features. So, which again is kind of a pro and a con, but we'll get to that when we talk about Octane. If you need to export to Game Engine, if you need to export to Sketchfab, or you need to have some sort of PBR workflow, Octane doesn't really support that. And I could be wrong, and you let me know if I am, but I've been trying to work on it. I'll talk more about it when we get to Octane, but right now I've not found a good way to export a diffuse map, a normal map, a roughness map, all the maps that I would need for a regular PBR workflow. I have not been able to do that in Octane, and I've asked in their forums, I've asked in their Facebook groups, and I've not found a good answer. I have been able to export diffuse maps, but not all these other maps. So that's a big problem for me, for a lot of my projects. And then the last thing is that Cycles is a lot easier to learn, and it's a lot easier to get information. Octane is amazing, and they have a plugin for every piece of software, for Cinema 4D, for After Effects, for Nuke, for Katana, for all these softwares. And that's great, and that's cool. But one of the problems is when you go to search for something, so I want to say, oh, how do I bake lighting textures in Octane? You might figure out how to do it in Cinema 4D, but that doesn't really help me in Blender. Or I have to translate, well, okay, if they're using a tag in Cinema 4D, what does that mean, and where would that be found in Blender? And there are, they do have their own forums for Octane, and there is a Facebook group that's called Octane for Blender group or something like that, and you can ask a few people there. But in my experience so far, the information's not as easily accessible. And Cycles, even on old version of Cycles, it's very similar still. So you can find a lot of the answers that you need, I think, a lot easier in Cycles than you can for Octane. So those are the reasons, to use Cycles. Okay, so now let's talk about Octane for Blender. Octane for Blender is very cool. There's a lot of great features about it, and Octane as a render engine is an amazing render engine. Here are some reasons to choose Octane for Blender over Cycles. If you are already familiar with Octane, so whether you used it in Cinema 4D or After Effects or wherever, if you're already familiar with Octane and how to create Octane materials and how to light in Octane, then I think it's a no-brainer. Use Octane for Blender, and also let me know how to use it better. If you only render, you don't need to export to Game Engine or Sketchfab or whatever. If you don't need to export those, you're only worried about rendering, then I think Octane is a really great option, because there's some really advanced features that you can do, and you can, for instance, you can change the look of your render very quickly, and you can make it. You can change the color and all that stuff without even having to change the world settings or anything. You can just very quickly use normal color correction tools and get a really great response here. It's really hard to get into if you've never used Octane before. It's really confusing at first, and hopefully the next videos I make will help you get started. But there's a lot of things to know about it. There's a lot how it creates its materials, how to do the lighting, where to check this, and their render settings just go on and on and on and on, and sometimes I've gotten stuck, and it's taken me hours and hours and hours to figure out that I had one thing unchecked, and that's what was screwing everything up. So, but I think that personally, I think it's definitely worth learning that the main part of your job or the main part of your business is rendering. If you're rendering still images or animations, I think Octane has some amazing options. And because there's so many features in their render engine, those things all pay off in the end. Once you know how to use them, I think that it's hard to go back to Cycles, because you go, oh, well, but I want this option. Oh, that don't have that option anymore. So that's another reason. If you render animation, like I talked about earlier, Octane is a great choice because it has persistent data and it's fast. That's just the best way to put it. It's fast. If you bake lighting to textures, Octane is amazing. This is actually the main reason why I started using Octane, and the main reason I still use it. So I'll just give you a quick example. I said I wasn't going to do hands-on, but here we go. If you want to, so say I want to bake this monkey. If I want to bake the lighting information to this texture, In cycles, it would take a long time, but also just the process of it would be difficult. And let me show you something. So with Octane, to bake stuff, you use it with the camera. So for instance, if I go to the camera settings and I go down here, you see Octane camera, and you keep scrolling down, I'll get into all this in other hands-on tutorials, but so you don't need to follow along, but just bear with me. So we're going to turn this into a baking camera. And right away, because this is already set up basically, you can see the lighting information baked to this texture and what it would look like. And this is, for me, this is a game changer, because I do a lot of work for going to Unreal or Unity or Web, and sometimes I like baking the texture, the lighting, using Blender. And using it in Octane is amazing, because if there's any problems with the UVs, I could see it immediately before I even push render, before I have to set up, the size or the resolution, any of that stuff. I can see that immediately, and that is amazing. And the other thing is, because it's set up as a camera, then to render, all I have to do is push F12, and I can render my my texture out, which also gives me options to use the compositing tab. And then I could composite either denoising, or if I want to do some color correction or whatever I want to do, if I want to composite something else into the material, I can do it through the compositor. So that's really great for me. The other thing that's great about specifically with textures, but this is also true for their rendering, is we're not even halfway done rendering these 500 samples. But if you look in here, it's like, well, actually, it's not. The grain is already gone. It already looks fine for my purposes. I can just stop right now. So I've been rendering for 36 seconds. I can just stop the render, and now I have this image that's rendered. If I did this in cycles, I would have to wait maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes to render that same thing that we just did in like 2 minutes. 40 seconds, I guess, is better accurate. So it's a lot faster baking textures, lighting to textures. It's a lot easier to see if you've screwed anything up, if you need to change the UVs, if this is going to work or not. And you can set it up to render as a camera. And I really don't want to get into this right now, but the other thing that's really cool about that is you could set up, for instance, and I'll show it in another video, but you could set it up to render a different texture for each frame. So you could have, if you have 50 different textures you're baking lighting to, you can actually just set it up as an animation and then render animation, and it would render out, it would render all those, 50 textures to images, and then you wouldn't have to save them externally or do any of that stuff. So it's a very, very, very cool feature that I'm personally really excited about. Another reason to use Octane is if you have multiple GPUs, if you have a GPU farm, for instance, but even if you just have like a few extra computers laying around, like I have an Alienware with a 1080 card in it, and you're able to buy the enterprise subscription plus the render nodes, which aren't that expensive. I think it's like $8 a month per render node, and I forget all the cost. But each GPU, you can do network rendering with Octane, which is a really awesome feature. You can't do network rendering with eCycles or cycles, but you can with Octane. If you're not familiar with what network rendering is, it's basically when you render, let me just go back into rendered mode here. So it's basically allows you to use however many GPUs. I think the max is 20 with Octane, but you can use all your GPUs to render one frame, even just one frame. So, and of course, if you're doing an animation, you could do the same thing with that. But it's not that difficult to set up. You have to set it up through a local area network, a LAN. And I was able to plug in this Alienware I haven't used in years, and I was able to hook it up and use the GPU on that computer to help speed up render times on this computer. And it did. It sped it up by probably almost twice as fast, even though this is 2080 and that's a 1080. It uses the CUDA cores, and it sped it up like really great. And if you have a bunch of those computers laying around, if you have an office and you have a bunch of computers, you can pretty easily set up a render farm that renders, uses all your GPUs to render this. So that can be a huge benefit. For me personally, I'm not really rendering a lot of animations. And usually when I do render something, even if it's a long render, I doesn't really matter. Like if I have something that's going to take an hour, which I don't even know if I have done that in a long time, just because the denoising is so great. But even if I'm doing like an 8K 360 pano, it doesn't really, if it takes 10 minutes, it's not going to change my life if I can get it down to 4 minutes. It doesn't matter for me. So right now, the speed up doesn't really, it's not really important to me. And then the last main, like obvious reason to use Octane is really just the advanced features that you have that are found in Octane. And I'm not going to get into all those reasons. I honestly don't even know all those reasons. But there's a lot to love about Octane. There's a lot of really cool features that you can do. And one of the things that you can do is you can even appear in this the global illumination mode, or excuse me, the kernel type. You can actually change this from default direct light, which is very fast, to path trace, which is a little bit more accurate, and to PMC, which I think is even more accurate and slower, but it is more accurate. You have clay mode, which is great for showing off like topology and stuff. But yeah, you have right up front. You have a lot of great features that make it easy to get the look that you want. And same with their. Again, I'll go into how to do this later in a different video. But yeah, it's great to just easily. You can quickly make a look that is much. It's much easier for me. It's much easier to get a look that I like in Octane than it is in cycles or eCycles. And part of that is just the way that it's just the way it's set up. The last reason I would say to use Octane for Blender over cycles or eCycles is it's in a lot more mature render engine, and there are a lot of options. For me, one of the things I love about it is this Octane camera imager. And you can do this either globally by overriding all cameras, or you can do it on a camera per camera basis, which depending on what you're doing, it might be good to do it one by one or do it globally. But this allows you to get a look very fast. I can get a look like a contrast or saturation wise very, very quickly just using their camera imager. And as you can see, I can do it basically in real time. If I want to get this funky look here, and I want it to be, more neutral. I mean, you can do things so fast using there, and you can even do LUTs and everything. So that part is amazing. There's post-process settings, and in their render engine itself, there are a million different things you can use. Light IDs, which are really cool. They have adaptive sampling, which Cycles has now as well. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff to show, and there's a lot of things you can do in Octane that Cycles just straight up doesn't have. And here's some of those options here. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the video. We talked about Octane for Blender, we talked about cycles and eCycles, and hopefully I gave you an overview of some of the obvious reasons to choose one over the other. In the next videos, I'm going to be getting into specifics of Octane for Blender and specifics of eCycles, and I'm going to show you some of the things I love and some of the things I don't love, and I'll hopefully be able to show you where to find resources as well, specifically for Octane for Blender, because I think it's hard to find good information about Octane for Blender, and you kind of have to connect dots between different software that they have and where you might find that in the Blender settings. Okay, thanks for watching. Again, I'm Alex Pierce. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos about Octane for Blender or for eCycles or Blender stuff in general. All right, take care.